All right. Welcome back, everyone. This is the 16th meeting after a couple week break that was mostly caused by my chaos during my move. Work has been going on by the rest of the team since luckily I was the only one with this interruption to life. So there's some things to report back on this call. I can give updates on a whole bunch of things. I know there's been a lot of discussion going on about features. We can kind of dive into some of that as well. And yeah, one, I guess, quick note is that I may have some background noise. I mentioned this in Telegram as well. We have movers that are delivering all of our stuff finally, and they're supposed to be showing up any minute. So hopefully they're not too noisy. I may be muting myself during parts if they get too noisy. And yeah, welcome to my chaos. It's spilling over into this call a little bit. So first, kind of, I guess I'll just dive into some updates while it's still kind of quiet. And then after all the updates, we can kind of dive into some discussions and just kind of naturally see where the call goes. So for those of you listening in the audience side of things, if you want to jump in, I think there's like a request to join button that just ask for a name and like maybe even like a topic or something. I don't know exactly. Or feel free to use the chat. Probably the chat in Riverside is going to be easiest, but I think we're still getting a grasp on how to handle the chat from YouTube at the same time. They're not integrated together. So we're still figuring this out. This is our second recording using Riverside and still giving it its fair shake. So yeah, kind of all that out of the way. There is, for the session kit, in the session kit world, we have a new release brewing. You can kind of see outstanding pull requests in a bunch of different repositories right now. I think they're all labeled as 0.4. something in the pull requests, but that's all going to change. This is going to be an 0.5 release. There are some reverse compatibility, like backwards compatibility changes that it wouldn't necessarily break things, but it would make it so certain things don't look as nice if you were to use this stuff together in an 0.4 release. So we're just going to push up to an 0.5 release and treat this as kind of a backwards compatibility breaking change version. So that is, as far as I'm concerned, pretty close. There's a few nice to haves that I'd like to get in. I'm hoping that we're going to see those commits added to the pull requests today. And then once they're merged in, probably do a final review either today or tomorrow and get the release out, the 0.5 release out within the next couple of days. It'll have pretty much any issue that you've seen closed on GitHub or any feature release or feature requests that you've seen like approved that'll be in this. It's a lot of UI updates. There's going to be a settings panel now, which I could probably show here towards the end of the call or a little bit further in if we want. It's going to give the user control over the interface itself in some regards, and the developer can also specify some of that, specify the defaults. There's kind of this topology of different who chooses how it looks at this point. So I guess kind of at the top, the user can ultimately pick what they want, but the developer can also specify what a default is. And then the web renderer itself also has a default, which we have defined. So you can climb up that ladder and change animations, colors, languages, some of the more minor things. And it's going to establish that portion of the user interface in one place. So that way it is going to be at least accessible for everyone to tweak on. And we'll definitely be interested in any feedback or situations that's not able to cover. Where is this pull request on the web renderer? Again, it says 0.4.2, but it's going to be 0.5. We just haven't edited it. Minor things like the original scope of this PR was smaller. And as you can see, it is now a ton of commits and discussions and back and forths that we've had to change things. So this will be out soon. Again, hopefully by end of week, and then this will resolve a lot of the outstanding feedback that we've received over the last couple of weeks. So this is just the web renderer. There's a PR like this sitting on the session kit. A number of the wallets and transaction plugins also have releases that are going to be coming out as well. Coordinating these kinds of releases is always fun because of how many repositories it's spread across. So
maybe I'll just jump in quickly here.
Sure.
If you go back, apologies to that page you were on. Yeah, this since it's just mentioned here, the add countdown with spinner, I assume that's like based on expiry seconds, right?
Correct.
So this, I just wanted to let you know, like this is probably more of an Anchor thing than WharfKit. But currently, WharfKit honors the expired seconds in the model, like it shows you the correct time. But Anchor itself, when it pops up, it defaults what seems to 2 minutes, regardless of, you know, if it's more or less, you know, like the transaction has a different expiry seconds. It always seems to default to just 2 minutes, which is obviously, you know, like problematic.
Yeah, we're going to have to look into what's causing that. I know that when I use desktop, and I know I've seen it not 2 minutes, even recently. Like I think when like I'm signing an MSIG or I'm using some specific tool, I know it's set to an hour and I see the countdown starting at like 59 minutes and 50 some seconds. So I know that there's a way that Anchor will honor it, but it may not be, there may be a situation where it's not working.
But not if it's just maybe an ESR link directly. It could be one of those cases.
Yeah, it might be. We're going to have to, if we can figure out exactly what that case is, I'd be interested to know where that's at. Anchor shouldn't overwrite it if it's actually specified in the request that's coming in. The only time it'll update it or like set its own is when the values for the expiration and the block header and all that stuff are not defined. I can see there might be situations where the resource providers are kicking in and like co-signing the transaction, in which case those resource providers are going to overwrite the expiration date because they are like, that's just kind of part of the resource provider specification. You don't want, like if they're going to sign the transaction, they should, and pay for the resources, they get to pick when the expiration is. But Anchor shouldn't care.
Yeah, but I definitely noticed that, I tested it recently in Wharf.
All right. If you have like a app that even we can look at that's like displaying this behavior, that would be super helpful.
It's not public, but I can probably recreate something.
Cool. That'd be awesome. Thanks.
Thank you.
Cool. We'll generate full patch notes for this new release and kind of give everybody a brief overview of everything that's changing. I mean, visually, you're going to notice changes pretty quickly if you're familiar with the other interface. If you're not quite as deep into working with the earlier versions, you might not notice it, but it's definitely a lot more crisp. A lot of the unstyled stuff and placeholder text, all of that should be resolved. We still have a few minor overlap things that I'm hoping will be resolved before we get this out the door, but with how flexible and modular is not the right word, but how many edge cases there are in using this, we anticipate at least like some situations might still have some odd display issues. So reporting those would be super helpful if you stumble into them, and just ways to reproduce them. So that way we can make sure that we're covering as many edge cases as possible. So yeah, that's in a nutshell kind of where the session kit's at. If there is any really critical things that need to be addressed within the session kit that you know of, feel free to share it with us and we can try to squeeze it in if it's not too hard. Otherwise, we'll definitely get to it in a future release. So cool. I'm gonna move on unless anybody had anything session kit related, I guess related to the next update they wanted to jump in with. Otherwise, there will always be time towards the end to kind of cover that as well. So cool. Next big topic. The website is pretty much going to be leaving the design phase here soon and moving into a development phase. Tomorrow, we kind of have a call to go over where it's at from not so much a design perspective, but a content perspective. And we have, I guess we're kind of deeming this the version 2 of the website. Right now, it's a very simple website that just basically hosts these calls and has a little bit about the brand. The next version of the website is going to be focused on the session kit itself. We're doing a phased release on this website. We've probably mentioned that in the past, where instead of building the end target for the website, we're building towards the next target, essentially. And we're going to keep evolving this website over time. So this next version is going to be focused on what Wharf is, and leading people into the session kit while also leaving small hints of what the other kits are. It is going to be to get people involved in this initial phase that many of you have already been involved in, but just be a public resource for that. It'll have some small portion of guides related to the session kit. It'll have a subset of the documentation for the session kit, and it's going to have stubs for a lot of other things to just kind of illustrate what's coming in the future, whether it be the contract kit or core documentation or things about EOSIO signing requests. There's going to be areas that will be, coming soon labeled. And then we will be kind of slotting those pieces in version 3 and version 4 of the website as we move forward. So a very much incremental approach to just getting this out and online. Development, I'm hoping won't take too long. The website framework itself is online. I think the only fundamental piece we really need to add into kind of the framework that we're using for the website is localization. And we have been working on localization pretty closely for both Anchor and the actual SDK itself for last 3 or 4 months now. So we've gotten a pretty good grasp on how we're doing that. So it should be fairly easy to slot right into the website. What are my other notes?
I guess the most important thing, like when I went to the site, the one thing I want to see is like a quick example on how to use it with Node.js, a quick example how to use it on like a front end, for example. Since you have those already, you have for different front ends, maybe also just linking that like a very easy thing and providing a simple Node.js example is probably what most people visiting the site will want to look at first.
Yep, very much agreed. And those will all be, the way it's laid out right now is we have 2 kind of educational areas. Well, I guess one of them is educational and one of them is reference materials. The educational side, which I believe we're calling like guides right now, will be how to do things, and the how to put in a front end and how to build a Node.js application on like a backend side will both be part of those, the guides section. And then in the reference side of things is where we're really going to get into the technicals of it and be like, here is the actual session kit itself. Here are, the internals of it. Here's the web renderer. Here is like the browser local storage engine, and be more about how, if you really want to start extending the session kit or any component of Wharf, that'll be kind of in this reference area. So those 2 will definitely be covered. We will probably be lifting and updating some of the content out of like articles like this. These early looks still work. Some of the syntax may have changed, But these articles we put into the blog themselves were really meant to be kind of temporary documentation on how you can use it right now, whereas the actual guides themselves will be forever content. That's our long tail results, whereas these are meant to be kind of short tail. So yeah, those will definitely be there. And I believe even the homepage and the session kit page, because there will be an individual page for each kit that kind of gets you deep into what that piece of Wharf is. Those will all have like ready to get started. Here's a link that dives you right into a guide. So definitely covering that. But once we actually have that early version published, like if we're not meeting your expectations on how easy it is to just like jump in and see how this functions, be critical, like let us know, and we can, adapt to that. Working in this kind of bubble is hard sometimes.
I'm guessing that the intention in the future with iterations is that once the quote unquote easy to use kits come out, that they'll focus on those instead of the raw core kit.
Correct. Yeah. And you'll still have access, and maybe there'll be like links that dive you into like some of the more advanced topics, but those are definitely not where we want people to start. It should be you're starting on like the really easy stuff, whether it's you're building for the session kit specifically, it's like, okay, I'm building a web app and I need that login functionality, or alternatively, I'm building like a script that runs on a server using Node.js, and I just need to read or write data. And then from there, you can get much, much deeper, writing your own plugins and creating your own storage adapters or caching mechanisms. Like everything's extensible, but that's not going to be in the user's face to begin with. You'll have to dig a little bit to get to that stuff. Cool. So that's kind of where the website's at. There's been a lot of focus on that. Well, I've been disconnected. And the other thing, kind of shifting topics, is that the contract kit has also been a major focus of the team during my absence in these meetings. So we did a review of that last night. The code generation piece of the contract kit is functional. It needs some cleanup and some refactoring. But what I saw last night, which I haven't run personally myself, just I have been focused on the session kit, but it is generating TypeScript, which can then be compiled down to JavaScript. It takes in a contract name, like you give it a contract, and it will basically look at the contract, look at the ABIs, and generate all of the internals that go towards optimizing call patterns and helping the developer actually use that contract. Like the example I saw was for the EOSIO token contract, and it defined all of the structs in code. Basically, that is the ABI essentially in core world, so that those can be used, and not every call needs to call get ABI. This will make it so that if you're creating action data in your application, for example, you are defining the transfer action. You would use that transfer struct that was automatically generated. You would import it into your file. And as you're filling it out, your IDE is going to know the fields that go into a transfer operation. It's going to know you need the from, the to, the amount, and the memo, or maybe it was quantity. I always mix those up myself. That's why I need this. And then likewise, it also generates an instance of a contract object that you can also just call methods on, instead of having to manually create action data. I know that is, at least for me, I constantly have to reference this stuff as I am like, oh, when the user clicks this button in my application, it needs to do this. You have to write out that whole thing that has the account name, the contract name, the authorizations, and then all of the data in the proper order. These methods that it will generate on the contract object will give you, you'll have an instance of the contract and you'll call dot transfer. And then it knows that that is the transfer action for that contract. And the parameters of that function call will be the data that it needs. So it will give you an option to not work with those gigantic JSON blobs, which in theory should be a lot more welcoming for developers who aren't familiar with that free-form JSON that we're also familiar to work with. So
I have some questions.
Yeah.
Because we're kind of introducing some new paradigms here, which I think are actually standard in other ecosystems, but I'd like to understand how they're actually going to work here. So the contract or the object construction will actually happen as a precursor to your running environment, right? So this is a compiled or a pre-compiled object, right? This is something which will have TypeScript safety while you're writing code, correct?
Correct. And one thing to note is that you can also dynamically create these during runtime. It's just the goal is for you to do them during build time, so that way you're optimizing API calls and your developer experience. Like you as a developer, your IDE is going to know how to operate with these. Like IntelliSense and auto-completion are going to be able to see what is expected to be able to do these things.
So that's exactly where I'm going with this, is that I think if we take Ethereum as an example, because I think that's the best example of SDKs that do this, is that you inject the ABIs in your development environment, and then it creates all that stuff for you. But of course, the problem here on our side is that we could update the ABIs on chain because those ABIs are stored on chain in EOS, and they will possibly conflict with the ABIs that we have injected into our local. So is it always going to be defaulting to injected ABIs, or is there going to be some kind of mechanism which enforces dynamic ABIs from the chain?
I mean, I think to start with, it's just going to be the contract that existed at runtime. But I think where you're heading is definitely a good improvement, where it could validate whether that's even like correct anymore, whether it's using the hash or whether it's using some other mechanism. And then it could maybe flip over to the dynamic mode and like pull in the code itself. Maybe that's an option.
At a bare minimum, it should. So the core problem here is that there's no erroring out when the ABI is a mismatch, right? It'll simply accept that ABI as is, but I'm unsure about the behavior of what would happen if you tried to use a different ABI from what's actually on a contract. I don't know if it'll fail, or if it'll try to use a possibly malformed ABI and what that would cause on chain. I'm not sure what the outcome of that would actually be, if it accepts the transaction or rejects it.
I'm not 100%, but I'm maybe 80 or 90% sure that the transaction will fail, that I won't be able to like read the data appropriately. Yeah, I think the chain itself would be like, we can't decode this action and then fail out. And the reason I'm pretty sure about that is because we've been doing this in our applications for a while now using Core. You have to manually define these ABIs as code. They were never generated automatically unless you used an external tool. And when contracts would change on us in that situation, we would get serialization errors. So definitely something that we'll have to add in. There's going to be a ton of unit testing wrapped around this. The code generation part itself, we have some unit testing around it, but it's not as easy to do, just simply because it's generating code that then we have to test. But once we get into actually using the generated code into the unit tests, we'll be able to hopefully write a test for this that kind of proves that that is the case. And then we'll be able to maybe build some sort of fallback functionality into that.
Does this also include the getter functions for tables?
Yes. That is kind of the next part. that we're still working on the syntax for that, kind of going back and forth about what's best. I think where we're at right now, and definitely open to feedback once we have kind of this initial function going, is that we're actually going to use cursors, because the way that table calls actually happen is very inconsistent, and it's based on the API node. So we want to be able to return a cursor back as opposed to just a subset of rows. And then on the cursor, we're either going to be able to guarantee that you're getting the amount of rows you wanted to request, whether that takes 1 or 2 or 3 API calls that'll just all happen seamlessly in the background. But then if you ask for 100 and you wanted 100 more, instead of, taking the results, looking at them more, creating a new table row call, on that cursor, you'll just be able to call more, and it will give you the next iteration of those results. So that's a lot of code that we're also currently baking into it and writing unit tests around. And certainly an area we're going to want a ton of feedback on. And it's worth noting that if you don't want to use this cursor approach, get table rows and get table rows by scope or whatever that other call is. It's always going to exist, and you can always use that kind of traditional way of retrieving data from tables. But we're looking to kind of reinvent that for new developers, because get table rows is a really confusing freeform JSON API call that just is a mess.
What about secondary indexes?
Those you'll be able to specify as well. We're
It's not
not sure.
generated. I don't think you can automatically generate that.
Yeah, I don't know if we'll be able to automatically generate that. You're right. It's like that information's not openly displayed in many places, which maybe that's a case for an improvement or a new API call or a new field on an ABI or something. I'm hoping that, like, by the time we have an MVP of the contract kit, we're going to be able to point at, like, here's a bucket list of things that the Node.js APIs could do better that would really improve the contract kit.
But I think if you're using secondary indexes and stuff, like, you're not necessarily like a noob in the space. And this is more targeting people who, starting or not familiar with what the fields are or things of the sort. And, to make it easier, I guess, for regular ones too. But you'll always be able to do it like just normal, get table rows and specify all the normal fields that I see.
Absolutely.
Asking about how that would be done within that. So is it going to be like an optional parameter at the end of the get table rows for a secondary index definition, or the index name or something like that?
I don't have specifics yet, but I think it'll be when you're setting up your initial kind of call to that table. It'll probably be a secondary parameter on the function call. Like, it'll default to the primary index, and then there will be some way to specify a secondary, and whether or not, like, that might just be freeform JSON once again.
I guess it's not even defined as a name, is it? It's just like tertiary or that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
That's annoying.
Currently, yeah, it is. But hopefully, like, the goal, and I think we even talked about this a little bit in the Wallet Plus paper, over a year ago at this point, was that we know that, or maybe it was in the API Plus paper, either way, we know that querying data from Node.js is hard. It's hard to get contract data right now. So the goal with the contract kit is to abstract that down into an easy way. And then during the abstraction, it might get really kind of convoluted in the back end. And we're going to be able to point at that stuff and say, hey, this is currently what's required to actually make this easy from a developer perspective. And the backend's a mess because of the API calls required. And some things may be impossible, like this additional indexes. But then hopefully we can point to that and say, hey, let's add a V2 get table rows call or something that then offers this capability. Or maybe we extend on the ABI schema to be able to define this kind of stuff. And
I'll tell you what,
get
honestly,
some.
I think the general way that we've been doing like data retrieval from the chain in EOS or in Antelope forever has been very strange. It's kind of like giving everybody access to a database accessor versus giving like CRUD
Mhm.
operation. And I think that the way that other chains do it and the newer capabilities of Antelope to allow return values on functions is probably a good thing for us to lean on, where uh, you're you're enabled to create getters inside of your smart contract which actually do all that stuff for you, so that you don't have to deal
Yeah.
with that crap outside.
Yeah. And that's actually a topic that we've been talking about, is these new read-only calls and how that plays into the contract kit itself. I mean, we wrote the scope for Wharf, what was it, like 7 months ago or something like that, and that wasn't a thing at that point. So I don't know if read-only calls are going to be a part of this from the very beginning, but definitely figuring out a way to get that in is going to be important. I think we just lost Nathan.
He's back.
Oh, he's back.
Sorry about that. Could you say that again?
I was just saying that the entire concept of read-only contract calls is something that, being so new, isn't even part of our scope right now. We are talking about it right now and figuring out how that fits in this new paradigm of table data. But like, I don't know if that's going to be part of this initial release, how we kind of scope that in, and how we work it in. Like, I was talking to the team about it last week, and like, we don't even know of a contract that uses it yet to test against. So like, one of our devs is talking about building a contract and learning the read-only call patterns, so that way we can actually start integrating and testing that and seeing what level of effort it would take to pull it in.
I had to test it for the bridge stuff that we do, because we need to kind of check if there's an action return value, and EOS Nation has actually a contract out that could be used for that.
Awesome. If you can share that, whatever that contract is and whatever the method is on that, that would be super helpful to us, because like I said, we didn't even know which contract existed that may have this yet.
Yeah, for sure. I'll DM you.
Awesome. Much appreciated. But I mean, circling all the way back, like, that is kind of wrapping our heads around these new calls and writing their own getters, like contract developers being able to write their own getters for this data rather than using get table rows. It's like a whole new paradigm that I think is going to be fairly big. And me, being probably the least experienced contract developer here, that's an assumption I'm making, but any and all feedback on how that would work in applications on the front end is definitely going to be appreciated. I think that those getters should appear in the ABI, I'm assuming. And the code generation portion of it should automatically define those getters. So at least they'd be accessible, but then it's like, how do we type the return values and make it so that's easy to get? Yeah, there's a lot of unknowns around that, and both in how it's going to be done and how we fit it into the project scope right now. But certainly a very hot topic with how new it is and how
I didn't look
promising
into
it
it
seems.
much, but I'm not sure if you have an action return value that implies that it didn't do a change to the state. I don't think it implies it's only a read-only transaction. Just something to note.
Yeah. We, like, right now, all we have is the transact call, which is how read-only transactions would have to flow through. But really, there almost should be like a new method for this that needs to be created that indicates this doesn't need to be signed. You're not expecting it to be broadcast. It's not really a transaction anymore, even though it flows through the same pipeline. Like if you were using EOS.js.
a send read-only transaction.
What was that?
If I'm not mistaken, a send read-only transaction call outside of the send transaction or send transaction queue.
All right. I have to look
Yeah,
into
actually,
that
the new
too.
Leap, in New Leap, there's a lot of stuff that's paralyzing all these read-only transactions outside Compute API. So
It's still documented. So the release is probably the best place for that.
Makes sense. Yeah, that is definitely it's shaking things up on our side design wise, how we're working towards the contract. And I really can't, all I can do is speculate at this point as to what is going to change based on this kind of like paradigm shift that's going to happen in contract development. And I know contract developers are just starting with that now.
You did bring up an interesting point, which I'm going to have to check. I'm not sure if the ABI, I would assume so, but I'm not sure if the ABI specifies a struct type or a return type in it, if it's a struct. So I'll make a note to check that on our side and make sure that it's compatible with what you would require in order to create jitters with a defined return type in TypeScript for this.
Awesome, much appreciated. Because yeah, being able to like code generate based on that information to make it even easier to access those getters would be, I think, huge for contract developers building the front end on this side. Awesome. I think we kind of naturally covered a lot of what's going on in the contract kit right now. It's looking promising. I'm excited about where it's going to head. Internally, we've been doing a lot of what the contract kit does manually, just using BIOS-IO Core. But this is really going to up it. And then it's going to be a matter of how do we work this into just natural build processes to kind of create this optimization. Like it'll go in the templates and you'll be able to specify contracts and whatever that you're going to use. But then for applications like block explorers, where like really a block explorer interacts with every contract on the chain, we need that dynamic mode. That's not during the pre-built type. Like maybe the block explorer is going to pre-generate the system contracts and like cache those or something. Or maybe it's just all dynamic, but either way, it needs that dynamic capability. So that way, you know, I go and create a contract and I look at that contract on that block explorer that I don't control. That block explorer can still then utilize the contract kit to retrieve data, to perform transactions, to do that more power user stuff.
FYI, in the ABI, at least the one I linked to, it seems that, you know how in the ABI usually have the actions array, now you also have an action results array with the name of the action and the result type to expect, which I assume is for the action return.
Do you know if it had I'll just clear out this ticket for myself right now. Do you know if it has in that contract specifically, if there's a return type of one of the predefined structs in the type structs?
Yeah, it looks like it, but check, yeah, here's the link. It's just in the ABI.
Which is this whole thing? Like which action, or are these all return
Check
only actions?
the end, like you see the action results at the end.
Yep.
So then you have the action and the result type based on the type defined.
It does seem to have a type as type struct.
Yeah, and it's defining custom, which I'm assuming is up here somewhere. Custom value, custom. So then it would map to these.
Exactly.
Well, this should be easy to turn into like a getter function from TypeScript generation.
Yeah. Yeah, the one thing I don't see how it's like knowing which actions. I mean, we know from this example that these are all read-only actions, at least I'm assuming.
Not necessarily true. So they could just be actually return a value, not necessarily read.
Yeah. So
yes,
maybe
I don't know
some
if you want to do something specific to read-only transactions, like reading tables or something. Like any transaction you push on chain, I think it makes sense to, assume it's going to change the state at some point, and just you can incorporate the return value where you just return that to the user, but it's not guaranteed, as far as I can tell. But I didn't really look much into it, that it's a read-only. Just because it returns it.
Sounds like we would benefit from something like the pure or view modifiers that Solidity has, so that we could denote that a certain function is read-only from the contract in the ABI's perspective, which would then allow you to actually create a pure getter function versus something which is a getter plus state modification.
Yeah, and that's going to be.
Yeah, but then if you modify, like manually after it gets generated, and then someone thinks it's not going to write to the chain, and it's actually writing, and it already has giving you credentials anyway.
Well, I think that's part of the reason that we need some sort of identifier that indicates whether it's read-only or not, is because in the session kit or in the contract kit, if we denote that something is going to be read-only, we're not going to sign the transaction. Like, those don't require signatures, do they?
Depending, I think they do, like any normal transaction.
Huh.
Sign it to be able to send it to the chain, if I'm not mistaken.
Interesting. That
you can do with Compute API. No, actually, I think there is outside Compute API. There is something about the read transaction. I think Nathan was right about that. There's a special API endpoint, and then it just, I think that one doesn't need any permissions. I could be mixing up, but I know that.
You're very possibly right. I will definitely let you know once we document that. It's not something I have enough knowledge on.
Yeah, I think that's the case with all of us right now. So ideally, it would be nice if they just flowed through different paths. Like if I'm doing a read-only transaction as a getter to like just get a value, I don't want to have the user sign the transaction to load that data. And if that is the case and we don't need a signature, then those can like flow through a completely different path that doesn't interact with wallets or resource providers or anything like that. But if they do require,
and then you don't have to worry about the ABI, being manual or somebody trying to change something because there's no signature anyway.
Correct. Yeah. Lots of questions still around how all of this works. And then how it's going to play into the session kit and the contract kit. Because with, the normal actions on a contract, when you perform them on the contract kit, you call token contract.transfer, and then you fill out the information you need. It's going to then flow through the session kit to collect the required signatures and perform the appropriate plugin operations and all of that to make the transaction work. But if from the contract kit you call one of these getters or a read-only call that doesn't require a signature, then it's very possible we're going to completely bypass the session kit itself and just send that to the API and return the data. So lots of speculation on how that part of the contract kit is going to work. And with this being so fresh, being released, like a week or two ago, I have no promises on how this works just yet.
There's two things. There's the read-only transactions, which, yes, those are quite fresh. And then there's the return values, which I think that should have
quite some.
Yeah, it's been around for quite some time, but it also has some separate logic. So you could have something which does change state, but still you want it to return a value. And I think that's still value capture in the contracts kit.
Yeah, absolutely. And then giving that data back to the developer more easily, because I know right now when you're using those, you need to go dig through a big JSON blob to get the actual return values.
No, it's in the root, I think, of the trace of the action, if I remember correctly. It's quite easy to
just in
retrieve.
the root of the response? Nice.
Yeah.
Usually the contract developer itself, so you know what it's supposed to
Yeah.
return.
It's very true. I know nothing on our side right now will type that information based on anything. Probably all just comes back generically through our transact methods, but we should address that as well.
And I think the action return is more likely to be used by, like these kind of get calls than anything else, because currently it's not like the contract can read it, right? Like if you do an inline action or something, you're not going to get that action return value to be able to use it for your next inline.
Available outside of the
Exactly. So it makes a lot of sense that it will be commonly used for like these get methods that should be in theory read-only, or at least a lot of use cases will be read-only.
Makes sense. It's always fun trying to keep up in parallel with all these changes.
Wait till we get into EOS EVM.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, by the way, it's the same as that Ether account. Like,
we had like 3 weeks ago. Let's revisit that.
What was that, Nathan?
Those EVM discussions in WharfKit that we were having a couple weeks ago, we should probably revisit that at some point.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't kind of not Wharf related, but we're getting some exposure there. We're working on a bridge in Unicove right now that hopefully will be able to offer that kind of functionality in our interface for all the chains as well. And then that's going to be kind of our initial toe dipping into that EVM side of things for all of the chains. So definitely new experiences. Again, trying to keep up. Cool. Eric did comment that you do need to sign read-only. Might be a interesting user experience discussion to be had there.
Yeah, because read-only, like, unfortunately, like read-only is, like the new Leap, it's too many at the same time, just push more like threads, which is great. But now if you have to sign it, you're stuck using compute transaction for if you want to use this kind of get method. And then compute transaction is not parallelized because that one actually changes the state, then rolls it back. So it's like you don't get the benefits, Maybe there's a need for a new read-only without signature, Since it anyway doesn't change the state.
We were really looking forward to using the parallelization of read-only for our EVM calls. Because right now we basically execute a transaction, fail it, so they'll have to run in serial. So we have like a cluster of Node OS that we use just for those. And it was kind of a bummer when I found out that if you modify state, it reverts. So just like you just said, it won't work for us. We looked at kind of refactoring the contract, but it's a lot of work to bypass every storage write that might happen while you're executing a call. So it was a bummer. I'd love to see that as well. A way to do it read only, even though it's going to write to storage, throw it away at the end and let us do a read only call would be, I think, valuable for a lot of reasons.
Sounds like it. Again, as one of the least experienced contract devs here, can't contribute much, but I'm glad that these topics are coming up because from the Wharf perspective, it is going to impact even user experience. So we will have to find a good venue to really kind of collaborate on this and figure out what it actually needs. Cool. Well, just kind of as a time check, we're coming up on the hour mark. My agenda, I think we've made through it the most part. We covered the session kit, where that's at, this new release, the website, and then where the contract kit is at. I guess we can take this last little bit of the call. If there was anything specific you guys wanted to address, functionality-wise, criticism-wise, yeah, that kind of stuff.
Well, I guess just the last thing is to that thing we talked about, having the ability to hard code the ABI instead of making that request. So it's kind of like identity verification without having to deploy an ABI to the chain.
Yeah. I think I opened an issue for that in the session. If I did not, then...
Yeah, you did. If I remember
Yeah.
correctly.
Cool. I haven't looked at that one, but that is something that was on my agenda for today. There should be... the initial discussions we had on this on our... I think we talked about it on one of our dev calls yesterday, is just that when you're instantiating either the session kit or the session, you'll be able to pass in an array of these things. The session kit for if you're working in a front-end application, and the session for if you're working in a back-end application. And then it'll just kind of like, it's going to pre-inject them into the ABI cache that already exists. Like you're going to be pre-populating the ABI cache. And then in theory, it should work just to be able to pull that out of the cache, which the ABI cache already exists and we're already using it. And that in theory should make it so that the contract, or at least the ABI and the structs, don't have to exist on chain for you to be able to do that sort of verification and perform those transactions. So I will hopefully have an update on that soon. We still gotta actually write the code and try it, but we think we have a path forward for it.
Is there a way to do that on demand so that you can actually pull down or use the ABI to generate the TypeScript before build, but locally? I don't think there's any hooks for that within code itself. So you wouldn't be able to have, if you were, for instance, to construct an object with that ABI, you wouldn't have type safety from the IDE for that contract object, right?
Are you asking if that exists like right now, or I'm trying to...
I don't know if that's even possible.
I think it is. We have the ABI to core utility right now that it does code generation. And like, as I'm working on a front-end application, if I'm using one of those predefined structs, my IDE will yell at me, and so will ESLint if I'm not matching what the predefined struct was that was generated based on the ABI.
Predefined struct goes through some compilation process prior to using it, right?
Correct.
So it's not like, so imagine this situation. I'm inside of a file, I'm saying create new contract, and inside of that object, I'm defining the location of that ABI locally. It's not like my IDE can go and then generate those files and give me type safety in that file. I'd have
Correct.
to pre-file that stuff.
Yeah, I believe so. It has to exist as code before your IDE can like read that and then give you the type safety around that. So as far, yeah, and I don't know if there's a way around that. Definitely something to explore, but being able to dynamically call those, I mean, you're not going to have the type safety, but you'll at least have the ability to call that stuff. The IDE is not going to know it. But like all of that's going to be, you know, like instead of calling contract.transfer, you'd call contract, and then in brackets, like a variable name that knows its transfer from the UI or something like that.
Well,
Like
you
if you
could
were
probably do
building
type information as long as you gave it like a return property of any or something. It just wouldn't be very nice as a developer to work with that.
yeah. Yeah, it's definitely not going to be as nice if you're in that dynamic mode trying to work on things like that. Hopefully at least once, maybe even if you're like scaffolding the project or something, you'd be able to use the code generated version to get that type safety and all of the like the niceties that come along with that. So, I mean, if we can find a way to do that differently, certainly a change we'd want to make, but I don't think we've discovered that yet. Or it might not even be possible. So
I don't think that's possible without writing like some extension for VS Code or whatever else it is to like watch the code as you're writing it.
yeah.
Ridiculous.
Yeah. Or like saving it as a file somewhere, even if it was just the JSON of the ABI, like something I think has to be written somewhere, whether it's in memory or to a file, for you to be able to get that kind of stuff. Awesome. Well, we are coming up on the hour, and I am just now hearing moving noises, so I think we might have timed this rather well. So did you guys have anything else you wanted to cover, or is now a good point to wrap this up?
I guess it's something that's, instead of monitoring the code, like if you ever go down that path, it can just be on save hook for, like VS Code extension or something. Just will be much more performant.
True. There's probably a lot of flexible options on how we could work this into the IDEs and, make it a little bit easier for developers.
I guess we'll let you get back to your movers.
Yeah, I'm sure you can start hearing it now.
Oh, yeah.
So awesome. Well, thanks everyone. We will start doing these regularly again, and hopefully my life is a little bit less chaotic moving forward. And we will continue to push this forward. So much appreciated, and thanks.